Well, good morning, everybody, or evening, afternoon, whenever you're watching this. I think that's one of the neat things about online worship is you can do this whenever you are feeling that you're at your best to do this. And I hope you enjoy that, and I hope that works for you. I do hope, though, that you're getting a Sabbath. I think a lot of people think that the Sabbath is just a holy observance. But, holy observances always have an element of justice, of practicality, of whatever. And the idea is we all need a day of rest. God rested, even God rested on the seventh day. And, it's important. We all need a day of rest. And even if you have, and I know none of you have done this is a ridiculous example, but even if you have sat on the couch all week, you need a rest from that. You need a change. You need a day of something different that breathes life back into you. And, so I hope you're getting that, because a lot of us maybe think that we don't need a rest during this whatever quieter sort of time for many of us. But you need a rest from even that. Anyway, we're talking today about Genesis 22. Verses 1 to 14, which you can read on your own. I've got a link below to Bible Gateway, or you can read it in your home Bible. But I was excited. This is the story of Isaac and Abraham sacrificing Isaac. And I was excited to see this story come up in the lectionary because I've been thinking about it this week. And the reason for that is this book here. It's called Pastor in a Secular Age by Andrew Root. And I'm really impressed with this book. And it's not what it appears at first. This is a book that is written for ministers, explaining why so many ministers find themselves in a malaise, or maybe burned out, or searching for meaning. And I could sum that up really quickly. Like that's easy according to this book, and it's not actually what the book is about as far as I'm concerned. Because if you were a minister that is retiring this year, say you're 65 and you're retiring, when you signed up for ministry, that would have been 1980. 1980. Which means you were making the decision to go to seminary and everything probably around 1975. And yes, that was into the period of church decline, but only 7 years, which means you're only 7 years from the peak of Christian history in the West. So if you signed up at that time, today you have a completely different church than you did then. And I think that could be said for many different eras. The church today is very different than what a lot of people signed up for. And, at worst, they're upset. And at best, they're confused. And I say they simply because being a millennial, this is the only church I've known. This is what I signed up for, which I think boggles a lot of people's minds. But anyway, that's a whole other discussion. But the reason I really like this book is because it explains sort of church history as several different paradigms of Christianity, or several different eras where we expected different things out of the church. And I think that's a really, really important conversation to have. And what he's trying to say is that we're entering into a new paradigm. And some of us are mourning, most of us are mourning the old paradigm. We're losing what we know, and we're mourning that. But he's saying that there's something different we're entering into. And so he starts by doing that through history. He talks about when we were in an enchanted age and then moving into a disenchanted age. So think about a time where everything was magical and mystical. He uses the example of a priest who was murdered for political reasons and then his blood was captured in vials and sold because people thought it was mystical. People used to steal coins from the church and ministers' keys and things like that because they thought it was mystical. Everything was enchanted, and because this priest was killed doing priestly duties, they kind of thought he was special, and apparently his vials of blood are still on the market today. But anyway, so he talks about, there was an era where everything was mystical, and that was a long time. And then he talks about Augustine pastoring to ourselves. He talks about ordinary life and Jonathan Edwards. So there was a period, early in our history, church workers, we call them church workers today, but really monks, nuns, people like that, different kinds of priests would have done a lot of the work of the church. But after the Reformation, we didn't have monks or nuns or priests, or the Protestant church didn't. And what that means is that there's the priesthood of all believers. Everybody had a role in work. If you were a shoe shiner, then you shine shoes for God. God had a calling for you, and somehow that was, and so it meant that everything you did needed to be done perfectly and for God and in a holy way. And almost the negative of that is that at that time, ministers, the way that a minister got respect was sort of being urbane and polite and cultured and educated, and that was really important. And everybody was kind of expected to be at this really high standard. If that sounds familiar to you, if that's familiar conversation, just tuck that in the back of your mind. But that was really the way we encountered church in the Great Awakening. And then, and he talks about that through Jonathan Edwards. And then he talks about Henry Ward Beecher. And Henry Ward Beecher was sort of one of the first everyman ministers. And he was everyman to a fault. If you Google Henry Ward Beecher, he had a lot of very public affairs, which that's an issue. But, it's after everybody was held to this certain height, this certain, everybody was the priest, and the priest was expected to be this paragon of civil society. Henry Ward Beecher said, this is an impossible standard. I'm going to be like everybody. And he sort of brought the office of minister down. And he was incredibly successful. And then he talked about Harry Emerson Fosdick. Sort of in the early part of this, or the last century, and church as sort of a place for justice and change and things like that, and how at that point denominations and denominationalism became a lot less important, and it was more about the church doing things. So think about the church ministering to the rich so that they'd be more philanthropical, trying to get people to put their assets to use for good. Another example would be the Civil Rights Movement. Martin Luther King would have belonged to this era of preaching. And then the final one, and this is sort of the era we're just coming out of, is it's called When Purpose Becomes Mine and Authenticity Becomes King. And he uses Rick Warren and Saddleback Church, which is probably names you're very familiar with, as that example. The church sort of became your one-stop shop for everything. Like that's where you learn to be you, and you anyway. And he's suggesting we're coming out of that age and into something that I'm not convinced he knows what age we're coming into. He's got a good guess, but one of the things that he's talking about, I'm sort of 3/4 of the way finished his his guess at what this new age that the church is coming into, this new paradigm is. And he says it's about witnessing to a God who, as he says, shows up. But to him, it's very much witnessing to the fact that God is here and God is alive. And one of the ways he talks about that, he uses a bunch of different stories, and actually uses a great story about Hagar, and I'm going to steal it for something at some point, because he talks a lot about Hagar, and I've never thought about that story that way. But he talks about Abraham and Isaac. God shows up when we need God. He talks about God as a minister, which, okay, maybe. But, he uses the example at one point of a therapist. A therapist is not there to be with you through your problems. A therapist is there to help you sort through them and come up with coping mechanisms so that you can go back to life and live in a healthy way. A therapist is not going to show up to your wife's funeral or, talk to you the night you lost your job or anything like that. That's where he says a minister comes in. A minister is supposed to share life with you, and he says God is a minister. So when we are struggling, when we're going through some things, we need to witness to the fact that God shows up and is there with us. I want to ask you, does that sound complete? And I'm probably not doing Andrew Root justice. I think the book is really important, but I think his conclusions need to be developed further. And he's got another book coming out soon that's a follow-up to this, so maybe he does that in this book. But to me, there needs to be more, but I think it's an interesting idea. And he uses the Isaac and Abraham story by saying, Abraham was about to sacrifice his son, his only son, not his only son, Ishmael, but that's his only blood son, the son that he'd been waiting for, the son that meant so much to him. And God, that's an extreme low point, and God steps in, and that's when he feels God's presence. Now, the glaring problem with that is that God asked Abraham to sacrifice Isaac, and that's a problematic part of the story. I don't really want to get into that today. And I don't think that makes his story fall down. I think he's just, using that as an example of a God that shows up, a God that is there with us and witnesses. Anyway, I like this idea of a God that shows up. And one of the things that I am very aware that we need to talk about right now is what church is going to look like and what church is going to be like in 6 months, in a year, etc. It's really clear to me that church is changing anyway. We are not in the paradigm that our building was built in. In fact, our building was built, according to this book, 2 paradigms ago. Just think about that. The Roslyn congregation was formed like 3 paradigms ago, according to this book. And we're about to enter into another one. Change is happening. And now we're in this period where, we can't really ignore that because of the pandemic. We have to sit down and think about how life's going to be different. And I will be the first one to say we can't know, and it's too early to make any decisions because we don't know where the chips are going to fall, and that's what we've got to base our understanding on. But I do think it's a good time to just start having this conversation and having thoughts about where we're going to be and what church means to us in 2020. COVID-19 is forcing us to have that conversation, because whenever we open up, it could be September, it could be later, I really don't know. Whenever we open up, we are not going to be able to do what we usually do. And then as things loosen and as things change, we'll be able to do some things and not other things. It's the perfect time to be sitting down and thinking about, okay, we can't do what we want to do anyway for at least a year. We may never be back to normal. The post-COVID world will be different than the pre-COVID world. How do we want that to look? I think it would be a mistake to just ease into that without really thinking about it, to just fall into it without reflecting ahead of time, because we might get stuck with something that's not working for us, or we may fall into old habits that maybe they were working for us, maybe they weren't, but we should be able to say, hey, this is working for us and this is why. I think that's really important, rather than just sort of letting history push us in a direction. And so this is an excellent time to have that conversation. And in the coming weeks and months, I'm hoping to start up a book study. Mary and Bert and I are talking about how to do that. And I'm looking for books, and I think I might have found one to just keep that conversation going. And so it was really interesting to be reading really about the story. He leans heavily on the story of Abraham and Sarah and Hagar and Ishmael and Isaac, and to be just reading this week about this God who shows up in terms of this sacrifice. We only tend to see God. I would argue God's always there. I wouldn't argue. God is always there. But it's easiest to see God, or it's easiest to witness to God when we've given up everything else, when we're at that sort of rock bottom place. And that's what one of the things this story is about. Abraham found himself at a rock bottom place. And that's, regardless of how that started, that's when he came to a deeper understanding of God. And I don't think we're at rock bottom right now. It's just different, and it's difficult, but we've been through worse. And maybe it's time to sit down and think about how we know God. Where has God shown up during COVID, and where's God leading us afterwards? So I hope you think about that, and if you have an answer, I really invite you to respond in some way, because I really want to foster conversation. You can write me, and I can copy and paste it into the blog if you want, or you can just do it privately, whatever you think. You can look forward to this book study. You can do a video if you're feeling techie. Anybody that has a phone can do a video, and just phone me and ask how, and I'll tell you what I do. It's not hard. You can do a video if you want. You can phone me up, and maybe I'm trying to do more interview style videos, and maybe we can talk about that. I think it's really important. So, I hope you respond. What do you think this new paradigm we're coming into is going to be like? What do you think God's calling us to right now? How is the church going to be different? How should it have been different already? Now's the time to have the conversation. Amen.